going live, and we should be live. Oh, what a beautiful Wednesday we have. The birds are out chirping, the sun's out. It hasn't snowed like it did this weekend, so that's always a good sign for the middle of May. So, welcome to Chat with Chet. This is edition 10, and we are joined today by Mr. Matthew Houstle. Hi, Matt.
Hello.
How are you doing today?
Oh, great. I agree with all of your sentiments. It is not snowing, the sun is out, and it might actually be warm enough to not wear a jacket when I walk the dog.
That's fantastic. Matt is a very, very good disguise programmer, but more importantly has one of the most adorable dogs I've ever seen. Who I don't think Rudy will come down because Rudy in the basement seems dangerous, but...
No, that is not something I'm looking forward to introducing her to.
One day. So, we're just going to have a conversation about Matt's career and kind of its trajectory. To start out with, can you please just tell us some of your previous shows? Go ahead and what you're doing now, because I know you're no longer a freelance designer, or a programmer, rather.
So previous shows, I worked on a number of Broadway musicals and some plays. Some of the more notable ones, I worked on the off-Broadway production of Dear Evan Hansen. So even the current Broadway show file has a mix of my programming and Ben Keightley's programming. And if you look at the timeline, it's very clear whose is whose. Ben is an incredible programmer, but not as neat as I am. I worked on Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Jagged Little Pill pre-Broadway, Mean Girls, Beetlejuice. I started out as a lighting programmer before I moved to New York and just started doing video because it was something new and interesting, and also because, there was plenty of demand for the work, but I really did enjoy it. Now, these days, I actually have a full-time job sitting behind a desk doing systems design for experience installations. It's a lot of, putting in like LED walls or projection surfaces and adding interactivity or interesting things to keep people interested in where they're walking through, so building lobbies, museums, those sort of things. So it's a very similar vein, especially since we do consider a lot of storytelling, but it is also it's also very different at the same time.
Right, yeah, that's something I've really been interested in for my own life as I've looked at more experiential and installation design and looking at how that storytelling comes up. And so it's very interesting how our skills as a theatrical programmer and our friends who do theatrical design, how all of that transitions over. But let's start with, so you were a lighting programmer. You spent many years at ART in Boston, correct?
I did. I was the full-time, officially titled lightboard operator, which I feel is kind of a legacy title from when it was just, an obsession or even pre-obsession where you're just typing in channel numbers. By the time I got there, we'd upgraded to an EOS. We're doing a lot of musicals with moving lights, a lot of pre-Broadway. I was full time there for 4 years. That's also when I started learning how to do video programming. I had a little bit of installation background. I did some integration into conference rooms and classrooms when I was in college, but this like doing live and namely the programming. I asked my boss, like, hey, this is something new and interesting. Can I do this? And then the first season I was there, every show had video in it. So despite the fact that I was hired as a lighting programmer, I didn't program a single show on the lighting console, which had its pros and cons.
Right.
But I learned a lot because I got to work with, my very first show was on Watch Out, and I was just thrown into the fire. I had no idea what I was doing. Looking back, I did so many things wrong. But then my second show, Jim Finley, who I think you know. Do you know Jim?
I know Jim.
Yeah. he was the designer, and he knows Watch Out inside and out. So I got to take the things that I figured out on my own, and then take and like work with an expert and really start to learn how to work there. But it was great, very informative, and I got to work with a lot of phenomenal designers out of New York, including Peter Negrini, he's a large part of the reason my career is where it is. But even like Chris Ackerland, Ken Posner, Justin Townsend, it was a great experience. It was a great, especially a great learning opportunity, because at a regional level, we're doing these Broadway shows without the pressure of a Broadway show. You're not expected to necessarily live up to the level of a Broadway programmer, but if you put the time and effort in, you get those chances to make those mistakes and learn, but also do that level of programming and work with those designers who can help guide you in those places where you don't necessarily know the answer. They might have a solution, and they can help guide you, because they're not expecting the world from you like they would from their Broadway programmers.
Right. It's a good way to cut your teeth.
Yeah.
Mr. Ted Charles Brown says hello from the chat, by the way.
Hello.
So you made the transition to New York, and when did you make that transition? Because I feel like I met you fairly early into your time into New York, but I'm really actually not sure.
I can't remember what year it was, but 2015 always rings a bell. Whether 2014 or 2015, it was right before. Wow, the show just slipped my brain.
The first one at Second Stage that season? No, you didn't do that one. That was Ben, I think.
No, I did the first. There was Invisible Thread.
Okay.
That was me, because we had done that. We had done the original version of that called Witness Uganda at ART with Peter.
I see.
But no, before that, I actually did The Last Ship with David Bengali on Broadway. Okay. It was Finding Neverland. Right before Finding Neverland came in, because I did the ART production of Finding Neverland. But at that point, I had officially left as full time and come back as a freelancer. Okay. And right after that show opened in Boston, we moved to New York.
Got it. Okay.
And I had a Broadway show all lined up thanks to David Bengali. And then, then things slowed down a little bit, and they ramped back up. But I did worked at Second Stage with Peter and did Witness Uganda, or Invisible Thread, and Dear Evan Hansen.
That was a very weird season at Second Stage, where they rented a D3 system for their entire season, because all three of the shows had video in them. And that was actually my first D3 show, was in between those two. Because I did Smart People with Zach between those, coming in because Kitely programmed it and had to leave before the end of Tech due to the snowstorm, because he was busy with NBA All-Stars, which I guess pays a little bit better than doing off-Broadway video.
Yeah.
And then we got...
That was an interesting...
Go ahead, sorry. No, totally, you.
There was an interesting... The whole goal was to rent a system for the entire season, because Dear Evan Hansen, which is at the end of the season, could not be done without D3 or the number of projectors. And so to try to make it affordable, the goal was to basically spread that system cost over the entire season and shoehorn the other shoes into the same system, including the hope was hang the projectors once and you just leave it for the season. That clearly did not work out. Dear Evan Hansen, I think we added a couple servers and added the whole thing got rebuilt. So in the end, I'm sure it didn't work out, but it did. I think Peter pushed the logic a little bit as well, so that he could get me onto D3 for Invisible Thread to get me a show where I could really become more familiar with the software, which was a huge advantage, because looking back to that show, I did so much wrong.
Right. Well, that's kind of the adventure, and always that first step out into a new software platform is really difficult to do. I was lucky doing Smart People because I had the dear friend Rod, who was back behind me the whole time as basically a safety net. And actually, Rod McLaughlin suggested me for the job. I found out later, which was really nice to hear. And I adore him, so it was great times. And working with Peter is also interesting because Peter knows D3 just well enough to be able to guide and direct you. And he has such a defined workflow in it because so many of his shows are based around D3. So then your first major show was Dear Evan Hansen. You know, small little ditty. It was, 5 projectors at that point? Because I think we had 3 front of house and 2 for the floor. And then 23 hanging monitors because they cut one of the orchards, or they cut one of the sticks for Off-Broadway.
Yeah. Didn't fit.
Nothing about that show fit.
Yeah, and for that one, Asher and I went out to PRG Scene Shop because Ash had to write in the automation code to work with the PRG automation system. So we ended up going out to the scene shop to test it because they pre-built all of the automation out in their scene shop. And I think the first day we were there, we had nothing. The second day, it was a process. I remember the Skype call between Peter and Ash, where Ash said, "So when do you need that by?" And Peter's answer was, "Tomorrow." And Ash had not done it yet. So in the end, it ended up working, but it was those first few days of the scene shop were a little we had to, because we upgraded the show from I think 11 to 12, and that's when versioning was introduced, and that upgrade broke the connection to every asset in the show.
Oh wow!
And I had to manually reassign every. I mean, it's possible I could have sent it off to support and they would have could have fixed it, but it was actually a great opportunity for me to scrub through the entire timeline and clean up a bunch of stray keyframes and get things labeled in order the way I wanted to work because it was Ben's show file.
Right.
But I had to manually assign every asset to its container within the show.
That's a process. Dear Evan Hansen is one of the perfect examples of shows where if you're working on a 1920 1080 monitor, you almost want to turn it 90 degrees so that you have more space for your timeline because it stacks up a lot.
Oh, yeah, and that was back before they had a scroll bar on the timeline. And if you we had a couple group players that had a big label that says "Do not expand" because it would expand the timeline taller than your screen. And the only way to fix it was to restart the software.
I've picked up and done some work on Dear Evan Hansen since then, and so I've always wondered the "Do Not Expand" label. That's good to know history-wise. Yeah.
Yeah, I fortunately did a lot of the when I was able to clean up those groupings because when I was working on my Surface at the time, which had a 3:2 aspect ratio screen. So I had just that little bit of extra height that I could expand them, and then group them into subgroups.
Right.
So that you could actually get into those groups. Because before it was just one big group. So if you needed to make an edit, you kind of screwed yourself, but then you could open individual ones as long as you didn't open too many.
That show, if you haven't had the chance to see it, and assuming Broadway ever comes back, I highly suggest Dear Evan Hansen. It's a really fascinating video show, and it really is a video show. The set is just a projection surface.
And I would say it's still way up there on one of the most complex D3 shows.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's probably been surpassed now, but up until a year or two ago, I would still argue it's the most complex. The way the mappings and the automation is utilized is, I couldn't fathom doing it. I couldn't fathom developing it on any other system. Once it's been developed, there are definitely ways you could move it, but developing that show on any other system wouldn't be the show it is today.
Right. Oh, I still have headaches trying to look at that show file from a support standpoint, and then later on, actually programming it for small commercial shoots and B-roll has been. I've learned a lot, but that show holds up very well, and it's interesting. Automation is one of the things that really always attracted me to D3 is because of the fact that you have that 3D workflow and you're able to automation track individual objects and know exactly where they are in 3D space.
Yeah. Yeah, and then even on top of that, if you get to record it or if you do any of that like previous programming of that automation, you can work ahead and behind fairly effectively.
Yeah, which is life-changing, honestly.
Yes.
So, Dear Evan Hansen really kind of solidified you as a D3 programmer, it felt like. And then there were a couple other projects that came through there. You mentioned Charlie and Jagged, which are two very interesting aspects because, again, they deal with this automation tracking, but now they pivot towards black tracks, which is a much different workflow.
Yes. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, there was just one scene that used black tracks. There was a bunch of other standard automation. But for the Mike TV song, which for those of you who remember the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Mike TV is the kid who's obsessed with television. For our rendition, all the Oompa Loompas came out carrying these 16:9 basically wooden cutouts that looked like screens. I think the original idea was they'd all be carrying actual monitors, but the logistics of the weight, the cabling, because the Oompas were all little puppets, it made more sense to do black tracks. So we put 6 beacons on each one of these screens, and they danced around with them. So there was a lot of and this was still early in the black tracks implementation in D3, so there was a lot of figuring out what worked and what didn't work. But the great part about it was not only could we track those screens, and I believe we did a blend down the center, but we were projecting on everything else at the same time, and we wouldn't hit those screens.
Right.
But one of the things to figure out, and I'll talk about it. So in Jagged Little Pill, completely different. I guess there was actually real automation in that too, but the main projection surfaces for that show were these. If you put 2 of them together, they looked like your standard house shape. So each one was half of a house, about 14 feet tall, double-sided, and moved around the stage by actors on wheels.
Right.
And we were doing a 3-projector convergence across the entire set. Had to track those in real time because they were a huge part of the choreography.
Right.
Which from what I've been told, changed a bit when they moved it to New York, because when they were doing choreography, they didn't quite realize what that meant to have those being a huge part of the choreography, but also the main projection surface, because though black tracks is incredible and powerful, when it's fully calibrated and functioning, it does have its limitations.
Right.
One of the big things to figure out was you had to balance between accuracy and speed and acceleration.
Right.
So I could get a system that was tuned perfectly for them to move these things around really quickly, but if they changed directions rapidly, you would watch the image overshoot as it caught up, because there's a lot of prediction going on.
Right.
And then there's a lot of just the limitations of vibrations and people bumping into things, and when you turn that prediction on. So for Jagged Little Pill, there were a bunch of open layers in the timeline that would turn prediction on and off, and even sometimes lock the screens in place, because we would get to points where either the camera coverage wasn't perfect, or actors would bump into them, and these weren't built super square, so they had a little bit of rock to them.
Right.
And we couldn't lock that axis because that rock existed on the stage and we were converging.
Right.
So there's a lot of logistics. In Jagged Little Pill, I had the advantage that during the entire preview process, I was sitting in the back and just watching the show and tweaking small parameters to understand how they affected and how they, I was very careful because I didn't want to suddenly send something shooting off the stage, but I could, while they were doing a big choreographic number where they were moving quickly, I could turn prediction up and down just slightly and see how things lined up a little bit. And that's where I started playing with turning prediction on and off, and I was doing it manually for a few shows before I realized, okay, this is the way we need to go.
Right.
But yeah, one of the BlackTrax works great for lighting,
Right.
because your accuracy is inches.
Mm-hmm.
But when you get to projection, your accuracy is millimeters, and you can get the system there, but you've got a lot of constraints and limitations to that system, and you have to then be able to explain that to the choreographers and the directors who don't understand the technology. They just it either works or it doesn't. And so you have to explain, okay, no, they can't change directions that quickly, or we're going to overshoot. Or for Jagged Little Pill, once they landed, tell the actors, if you're off spike by a little bit, don't fix it, because that little nudge causes the whole screen to do this in software.
Yeah, there's any time that we start to add new technology into live performance, there's a learning jump that one has to go over.
Yeah. One thing that was really cool with the power of BlackTrax and what D3 can do with its mapping and its modeling was, I have a great picture, and I don't have it pulled up to share, but of my friend who was standing on stage looking out into the house, and the screens were set up 2 square to the proscenium and 2 angled back, and the back of one of those screens, which the projectors were 1 center and 2 kind of cross shooting. The back of the 2 side screens had image on them lined up exactly where it was supposed to be.
Oh, cool! Yeah.
The pixels were about this big because D3 was staring at the pixels, and it was a very stretched image. But it was landing perfectly. And there were moments you could see where when the screen was at almost a perpendicular angle to the projector, that when the system was fully calibrated, on a fresh calibration, you could see those 3-inch pixels lining up exactly where they were supposed to be across that stretched surface, and it was really, really impressive when it was working right. I did have to filter those out because it didn't take long, because all it took was a couple millimeters for those to be on the back wall versus on the surface. I can't expect any system to be that accurate all the time, but when it was working, it was quite impressive.
And BlackTrax's method of projector calibration is, I prefer it far to Quick Cal, but...
Well, it's a form of, it's technically a form of Quick Cal,
it is.
Your point guaranteed to be accurate. The hardest thing I found with that, and I learned, it wasn't until I did the Deep Blue Sea workshop that I figured out this trick, but doing your D3 ground plane, it is just squaring the 2 worlds together. So the best thing to do is actually choose physical points on the set, just any 3 points with enough difference in measurement, rather than trying to use the same BlackTrax ground plane. Because Charlie, the problem we ran into was we used the ground plane, but if you're off by on a 1 meter by 1 meter box on a 40 foot by 40 foot stage, excuse my mixing of units, but if you're off by a couple millimeters, that rotation is actually pretty severe. And so what we found was, we calibrated the projectors, they were in the BlackTrax world, which was rotated to the physical world ever so slightly. So getting those blends and such to work was not great. Couldn't just rotate the rest of the world because there was automation tracking and blending, and it was far too complicated to do that. And you could after we figured that out, we could rotate the BlackTrax world to be, if we figure out what's a square, but then we had to recalibrate all the projectors because they were still fixed in there. So it was an annoying game to play, but learned a lot. And then on Deep Blue Sea, I just chose a very big. I think I actually, what I did was I put a projector cone down on the floor and just chose the corners of the projector raster and measured where they were. Because even then, for that one in particular, I don't think it really mattered exactly the measurements because it was a big open field. But on a proscenium stage, I would just choose, you would do in Quick Cal, but I would choose 3 points on the set that you knew exactly where they were, and just place the beacon there. And you can easily get perfect measurements of 3 points on the set. Using a nice disto. So.
Totally. Yeah, that's a really smart workflow thing that hasn't trickled through all the programmers yet. I'm interested to see how it comes up once we're all doing shows again.
Yeah, because then especially if you're working on the fixed set, like a non-moving set, your black tracks and your scenic coordinates are then locked together.
Right. It's a really smart solution. And so, two last shows I want to cover, just going through your history on large shows, are one show I was both of them actually, I spent a fair amount of time working with you, one on site, one apart, which are Amelie and Beetlejuice. And you've worked a lot with Negrini's studios, Peter Negrini's designs, and it's been very, very interesting to watch your workflows evolve over that. Because Amelie was, well, you can explain better what was going on the set and what you learned from Amelie and then applied to Beetlejuice.
So Amelie was, it was a very three-dimensional set that we wanted to map. And there were two things going on that one. The big one being the set was all found furniture that was then assembled together. So there was no such thing as an accurate 3D model, and we didn't take a scan of that. I'm trying to remember if we actually did a scan when we were in LA or not, or if they just did that when they got to Broadway.
I think it was just Broadway. I don't think you did for LA.
Yeah, we were trying to figure out what the solutions were. So to kind of work around that, so the other part of that, which plays into this a little bit, was that when they did the show originally on a Berkeley Rep, it was a watch-out show. And so you didn't have 3D mapping. It was just projector cones, and you did the manual masking the old school way. Right. And Peter really liked the aesthetic of just the light falling onto the set and not being mapped precisely. So what we did is rather than feed maps or parallel maps, we did perspective maps. And we did 5 of them, one from the perspective of each projector. Technically, there were 6 projectors, but we took the center 2 and just combined them into a single center shot. And there was a whole bunch of stuff that we did to make the programming of that go much smoother and easier at that, which is a large part of the reason why Chet was heavily involved remotely, is that I ended up breaking the software quite a bit, having to work with support to get a lot of efficiency fixes put in, overnight. Including, I guess, when Tom overnight recoded the timeline from Python to C++ to gain a bunch of processing back. We were also on a mixed master, which you should never do with projection. That's a whole separate long conversation. So anyways, with the model, to help us, because we knew there were these specific phases of, like, there were cabinets and armoires and such that we wanted to be able to land on, and some of them we actually wanted to be able to map specifically, so we could do animations, we could trace edges, and we could fill, we could do like picture frames and such. But we didn't know exactly where any of them were, and we also needed the ability to calibrate the projectors. So we did a lot of measuring of points to do the projector calibration. But then after that, we had modeled each one of those cabinets, or even each one of the faces of those cabinets. I forgot how much we broke it down. I think it was by face. Or maybe it was by... We broke it down quite a bit. So that I could then move them around manually. Because there was a blend, and we had tried to avoid blending on things, but we had to blend in certain places. So we had to be able to move those around despite how the calibration landed, and despite where they were in the model versus real life. So we were, the usual problem of fighting, is it a calibration problem, is it a model problem, but we kind of cut that out by individually modeling each screen separately, and then moving them into place so it all looked good, which worked great, except going back to our performance issues, D3 in a perfect world would have one screen.
Yeah.
That's where it works most efficiently, but we all know that doesn't work. We had 150, 180 screens to break it down that much. And so that was one of the big things support kept saying was, well, you reduce your screen count. And so we ultimately, once we figured out where they all were by positioning them individually, I read all of those coordinates back to Robert, who then put them in the model, and we then pulled them back in and removed the individual ones,
Right.
which I thought was going to take a whole day, 2 days to do. But somehow we were really smart at the beginning and built our UV maps with each of the screens in a single UV map in its coordinate location, and then built it as a feed map. So all we had to do was replace the models and repoint the feed map, and we were done.
That's part of the reason your performance was so bad.
Well, yeah, probably. Actually, I didn't even think about that until
Yeah.
But it definitely meant that it took me like 20 minutes to replace 150 models with like 4 models and get all the mappings correct.
Fascinating. That's something that just clicked in for me because I didn't look at that side. I was more on the mix master network bleed side. Oh.
Yeah, that was other disaster.
I will say, I don't think we would have been as good of friends as we are now if not for the fact that I had to cancel the start of my Christmas break to fly out and spend a couple days in LA with you. I felt much closer with you after that whole experience.
My favorite part of that story is before I went out to LA, I jokingly said to you, what am I going to have to do to get you to come out to LA with us?
We figured it out.
And then somehow I broke the entire system.
It was a great trip.
For reference, we had a couple previews, or we had one preview, and then we kind of mitigated it a little bit, but where by the end of the show, that night's performance, both our main and backup servers were running at 10 frames per second. And support was all over trying to figure out what was going on and fix it. And in the end, we ended up with a workaround and just needed the system to be babysat until we were confident that the show was going to make it through the run. But it was definitely a Band-Aid and a workaround. And it was definitely a problem with something in the network on that system. Mm-hmm. Clearly the software was not handling it well, but since it's never been seen anywhere else, there was something weird going on with that network that was causing those problems.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, what are you going to say?
So that was Amelie. Let's pivot now to Beetlejuice, which Beetlejuice kind of built on a lot of what you guys learned for Amelie and led to, I think, a gorgeous show from everything I've seen of it.
Yeah, Amelie taught a lot, and some of it's also a culmination of every show we've done. Every one we've learned a lot about both the design end and the programming end of how we deal with more and more complex 3D environments. Mm-hmm. Up until Beetlejuice, Dear Evan Hansen, though it's all got a 3D model, it's a bunch of flat planes that are parallel to the proscenium, and so you can just do a lot of parallel mapping and get content through, and it's all square. It's fairly straightforward. But then you get to Beetlejuice, where there's not a single right angle on that show. Nothing is square to anything. And we ultimately used 5 projectors to map that set. And and every single piece of scenery moved.
Right.
It tracked, it rotated, it flew, and we wanted to track that all in real time.
Right.
So we had to A, figure out how to model those accurately, B, calibrate it, and C, figure out how to actually get those models into place on stage properly in their scenic, their true positions, which for some were easy, and some I'm still convinced they're not actually in the right place, but they're close enough that it works. So the main centerpiece is the living room, which is this house unit that tracks upstage and downstage. That requires all 5 projectors to cover, including the 5th projector being a little 5K projector on the first electric that is 3 feet from just the peak of the turret on the roof, because when we moved to the Winter Garden, because of how the proscenium and the balcony rail lined up, we couldn't get the top of that roof from the balcony rail. And it was we like looked at what it would look like to not have that projector, and we couldn't do it.
Right.
No one was happy about that there, us lighting anyone, but we had to do it. There was no option. So the first thing we did is we took a full photogrammetry scan of the set. Namely, we started with the house because that's where we had to calibrate. And, Robert then took that in. He had an existing model built. Either he built it or he got it from Scenery and modified it, but of the as-built. And then took this photogrammetry scan and started aligning lining all that up to put into D3. And we prioritized certain points that we knew we wanted to use for calibration, which had its pros and cons. The pro being, I was fairly sure that the calibration was right, but we didn't move a lot of the surfaces together, and we were blending and lining up and stuff, so it didn't look right anyway, so we had to go back and make sure everything was lined up properly, which Robert was also animating, so we had to figure out how his time was best divided.
Right.
But I made a huge point before we got into the theater about making sure we had that level of accuracy, because for every show up to that point, we were trying to do our dark time and calibrate a show with an inaccurate model.
Right.
Which meant I would spend my entire time calibrating and tweaking and twisting and turning and like doing things you're not supposed to do, like feed warping and, final adjusts of like crazy rotations and stuff to get the blends and everything to line up properly. And the problem you run into when you do that is then if you get time down the line to fix it, you've done a bunch of masking and stuff to compensate for errors and get off people's faces and such, that when you go and you fix it, all of that falls apart.
Right.
And you don't have the time to fix it. So the further and further you get into that mess, the harder and harder it is to work your way back to an accurate thing. And the big long-term problem is if a projector ever has to be swapped,
right,
there's no simple way to actually recalibrate that, and you have to bring a programmer back in. Not that in Beetlejuice we still have to bring a programmer back in. It's still too complicated. But B, the chances of it going back cleanly are you're really fighting yourself.
Right.
You're not going to get a lot of time to do that because that time is expensive.
Right.
So I pushed really hard. And it was fortunately heard to have that scan done before we went into our dark time, which was always hard to schedule because Scenery's always behind and there's a bunch of you have to coordinate and you need the pieces in place to do it. But then we ultimately benefited from multiple scans over time. Like we did scans in DC, we did a couple different calibrations in DC, which both meant our scans got more accurate, but I also learned more about the set, the inaccuracies of the model, and where we're seeing certain bleeds, but then Lux was actually a huge help in this, where you turn Lux on and you can actually see D3 doing that same bleed in the 3D model as you're seeing on stage, and you go, okay, that's just the thing it's trying to do. We'll have to do a mask for that.
Right.
And how to do the blends and which projector placement was best. The ceiling was the hardest part of that entire show. It never quite lined up right.
Right.
And it's still questionable whether or not it's model, projector, or other, or probably all three.
Right.
But yeah, once we got to Broadway, we had a pretty good system in place. And we eventually made some adjustments because the house also has 3 different sets of walls that are at different depths. So we had to do scans of all of those, but it meant if we were calibrating, we had to have a specific set of walls on.
Right.
So I think ultimately worked it out so we could find enough calibration points that were on pieces that didn't get, that were fixed, that were always the same depth, that we didn't need to do that.
Oh, that's great.
The other thing we had to do, and this is something I never like to calibrate to automated pieces.
Right.
Because the chance of them being the same, they're not necessarily going to be in the same place every time.
Right.
Because they move. They're bolted to the deck, they'll always be in that position. But not only did we have to do it to an automated piece, we had to calibrate with that piece in two different physical positions because there wasn't enough Z depth,
Right.
Or it wasn't enough depth differential from the eyes of the projectors in planes we had to get an accurate calibration.
Right.
So we actually had to move the set upstage and run a second calibration. Multi-pose is a great feature, but it then runs into like there are tricks that you could use in the past for like muting points and deleting points and uncalibrating if you screw something up. But if you screwed it up in one position and then moved to the second position, or if you screwed it up in the second position, which is worse, and you release it from the projector, you've released it in both positions. Right. So you had to be really careful in that position not to screw something up. And the biggest mistake I kept making was clicking on a point the projector couldn't actually see.
Oh, interesting. Oh, yeah, that would be...
And then
there's no way to...
D3 would grab it as a calibration point, and it would become accurate, and I'd have to release it, and it would release it in both positions.
Right. We're joined by Mr. Ian Crawford in the chat, by the way, who also knows Beetlejuice very, very well. He was the engineer
Hi, Ian.
for both DC and the Broadway run, and is all around just a great guy.
Yes. And my life is always made so much easier by his presence in the theater. So
I had him on my last Broadway show, and it was fantastic. So let's pivot now. So you are no longer a full-time freelance programmer. You've made the transition to real life.
The real world?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I mostly left that world. I mean, I still have ties in. I still go back in every so often, and I love doing that because I miss it dearly. But I needed a more regular schedule in my life. As a programmer, as you know, Chet, like, you just go from tech to tech to tech to tech. You don't have those convenient, like, 1-2 month prep periods or downtimes. It's just tech.
Yeah.
And that was just, I couldn't sustain that much longer. I have a puppy, I have a wife, a house, and I also found I didn't have time to even just like sit down and learn new skills. Just that was one of the biggest things for me, is that I didn't have that time to develop myself. If it wasn't like in the theater for a specific problem on a specific show. I'm
glad your list was puppy, wife, house, for the record.
To be fair, the puppy came well after I left 100%. The business. But actually, we have a puppy because I left the business, and can actually, deal with having a puppy. The wife, on the other hand, anyways, yeah. So I have a full-time job now. What one would call a desk job. One of the benefits being having an actual desk with a chair, and like like a laptop and.
What type of chair does your office have?
Well, they are terrible. They're like the cheapest, and they're like standing desks that are all at standing height. So that we have chairs that are tall enough for that. So you can't even just get, like, there are a few more comfortable chairs, but they're all lower.
Right.
And the desk height, I am at the height where it's either too low for me or too high for me. It's like too high when seated, but too low when standing. So, it all sounds really good. It is still better than a butt-borne piece of plywood. But it's actually not the improvement I was really hoping for. But I have regular hours now, which is an interesting thing. Like, it's weird because there's, like, lack of flexibility, but there's, like, flexibility, not lack of flexibility that I'm trying to figure out, where, like, people don't care as much if you're a little late because you don't have an entire theater waiting on you. Obviously, if I have a meeting there in time, so, and I still don't like being late. I get to work, early, partially because of train schedules, partially because that's just been so ingrained in me. But then it's also, the other thing is, like, I've got multiple projects at a time, and I've like basically been given a certain amount of time I'm allowed to work on each of those projects per week. That's not a fixed amount, but the project manager budgeted my time out. And so I have to keep track of like, okay, I did 20 minutes on this project and an hour on this project and, 4 hours on this project. And that is not something that I've adapted to very well, because I really like just being like, okay, I'm in the theater working on this show, I'm going to charge you for a day. And if I was working on another show, it's like, okay, that's like, some fixed amount of fee that we just negotiate. Like, I never really had to pay attention to, yes, I spent an hour on this and 2 hours on this. So that's been an interesting challenge to overcome for me personally. Is keeping all that. And also a little bit of like, okay, I've run out of things to do for the day. I can spend a whole bunch of time cleaning up this drafting or like researching this or like working on a project, but I've used up all my hours for the week. And for budgeting reasons, they don't really want you putting more time into projects than they've allotted you, unless it's necessary. So there's a lot of like, okay, I could be doing a lot of stuff to move this along and get us well ahead of where we need to be, but I don't have the hours allowed to do that. I've kind of lost that flexibility to just use my time as I feel is necessary.
And so then how has all of this been shifting with the whole COVID thing?
Well, things have slowed down for us. Partially, we're just in a general slow period because we have like anyone, but we had a bunch of big projects that just closed out. We have a few projects that are between design phases. This has definitely kind of made that between time stretch longer as different businesses their priorities have shifted. It's not necessarily that they don't want to spend the money, they're not going to go forward, but they don't have the time to focus on, okay, what's the, on design, they got to focus on how they keep their employees engaged and move forward. So, and I'm working from home, but, I can do 90% of my job from home anyways. So that hasn't been too bad. It's been an interesting adjustment doing design completely remotely. But it's working, but it's definitely, I miss moments of like, my colleague who sat behind me was one of our physical designers, and we worked on a number of projects together. And there were times I'd look around and go, oh, hey, you're working on X project. Let me look at what you've changed. Oh, cool. Like, that's really interesting. Or, oh, hey, that directly affects me. It's good that I know that that's going on, or I can give some input, or just, generally like you can walk around the office and see the work being done. And if it's your project, it can be really helpful because a lot of design decisions are made by people walking over to someone's desk. And sometimes that information doesn't propagate to the people who it affects. Because there's been many points where, like, right before a presentation, someone asked, did you update the drawings to reflect that we've added 2 projectors? Wait, when did this happen? Was anyone going to tell me that we added projectors? That has a bigger effect than just adding projectors, right?
That is one thing I really appreciated about working at D3 for 3 years, is especially the first 6-8 months when it was just me. It was basically the same as working from home because of the fact that everyone else is in a foreign country. I feel like I'm very well prepared to doing corporate work in this day and age because of having to deal with the lack of communication from London.
Yeah, it is interesting in our office because the office is mostly designers, which is we're a design firm. It makes sense, but they think like designers, and not that it's a bad thing, but it's an office full of designers, and so there's not a lot of the like engineering and technical. Like I'm much more technical. Like I can see design, I can speak design, I understand design, but I'm like technical first, design second. And I do have that advantage. I can do both because there are many people who can who really are stuck in one or the other and can't bleed into the other. But I look at some of our processes and like the way we deal with things and like how we're dealing with this current situation and go, this is so inefficient. There's such better ways of like managing this and processing and like and such, and it's just
Right.
designers don't necessarily think that way. It's design process. So it'd be good to have a little bit more of a balance in there, but we're figuring it out. The big one being we have like 6 different communications platforms that we work on. It's like Zoom, GoToMeeting, Teams, I think Skype's in there somewhere, Slack, and email, and some people text. And so it's like this mismatch of like, okay, which meeting is my meeting going to be on GoTo or Zoom? Is like, are we screen sharing? Are we turning webcams on? Are we not turning webcams on? And so I don't know why we use so many platforms.
There's a myriad of reasons, I'm sure, and some of it's personal preference depending on who you're talking to.
Yeah, and it's like, between Google Drive and OneDrive and the NAS we have at the like in the office that really everyone uses for some reason, despite the fact that it is incredibly slow and you disconnect from it all the time. And we all have obviously like terabytes of OneDrive storage that we can share amongst each other. And then I just despise Google Docs and Google Drive, but that is like the primary method of doing almost everything. And it's just a lot of like trying to get non-technical people to adapt to new technologies is not always and I get it from that perspective, like the time it takes to adapt, but I think we're wasting so much more time trying to figure out, okay, was that file on Google Drive or on the NAS? And did someone actually store it in the right folder? Is it in the shared working files folder or just in like the systems? Like, there's a lot
that's miserable.
Could be improved. Yeah.
So if there are any questions, please feel free to chime them in the chat. You've used D3 a little bit for your job now. How has that changed now that you are more this corporate as opposed to cowboy theater, for lack of a better phrase of it?
It's a lot more previs, like actually utilizing the previs features. Because when I was doing it for theater, the design was generally developed to a degree by the time I was on there. We would use the visualizer more for like actual programming than experimentation. And some of that is like Peter's team, they work very much in Adobe. It's faster for them. They don't know D3 well enough to previs. Finn's team, Frey, they actually do most of their previs in D3, which has its advantages. But I've been trying to show the office these tools, and it's an interesting. It's trying to teach them because again we use so many different tools, but they're very used to like high quality architectural renderings,
right?
Which are like ray tracing. They take hours to days to render out, depending on if they're a video or a still. And so if you're trying to just experiment with content, they're not great. With D3, you can just swap things in and out. The different mappings. We used it for a mock-up where I got a loaner server because I'm pushing to try to get D3 on some installs. And it was great because at the mock-up before, if they we had like this it was a bunch of columns of LED, and one of the things we were looking at, we were just testing content concepts essentially, like what worked and what didn't. We were even testing, it was a bunch of stock footage, but our content team rendered it out to fit across the width. It was just like waves rolling up on a beach, and the designer who was with us when we were looking at it internally was like, well, can we look at what it looks like for them to be on each face of the column flowing in? And with D3 it was like, yeah, sure, click 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 click, how's that look? And she was like, this is incredible. This would be, I'd have to like call back to the office and have to render it out. It would take a day for that to happen normally. But a lot of the power that D3 has is in its speed and flexibility. And when you think about installations, especially the kind of installations we're doing, which are a lot of interactive, like they're going to sit there for 5-10 years if all goes well. You've planned everything out, so you don't speed and flexibility are not things you're necessarily going to need, because you're working to a very specific pixel map. You've planned out the content. You're hooking it into a show control system,
right?
And so those advantages they don't carry a lot of weight.
Yeah.
That being said, the hardware and the software they developed for managing essentially redundancy and stability are incredible, but you have to then convince the team and the client to spend that extra money for a problem that may or may not occur.
Right.
Which is always a challenge of yes, spend a little more, and then if this problem comes up, it'll be fixed much faster, or this problem won't come up. And it's getting people to spend money on a hypothetical situation that is always tough.
Right.
So it's been a lot of teaching, because it's also a different workflow than the office is used to working in. So it's like teaching how to think in that way and how to work in that workflow and how to actually break out of that locked pixel map, that locked and utilize that flexibility both in our development, but also in some of our it can be very useful in installation as well for certain installations. But you have to convince people to break from that, having those conversations with the media team about what no, you don't need to mask out where the columns are, because the software will do that for me. You don't need to put that time and effort in, and if you do, then I can't manipulate it, I can't zoom it, I can't rotate it.
Right.
And try to convince them that no, you don't have to be so rigid. We have this flexibility now. It's tough to teach someone that.
Right. And in the end, how much are they going to utilize that when you still have to render out to the same pixel map if you're not going down D3 for the final performance? But
yeah, exactly. Yeah, but even some of the system development with conversations about people being well, we gotta, you have to rotate the display, your output to make this work. I'm no, there's software and technology and all this will do all this for you. There's no need to be so locked in if you design your system properly. So
I'm having flashbacks.
It's interesting.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. It's interesting coming from a world where you have to be super flexible, moving to a world where, they think you have to be super rigid.
Right. There's got to be a middle ground somewhere for both of it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for your time today. And Matt, thank you for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this stream. Join us next week where we continue on. And it's been a pleasure, everyone. Thank you.